When you looked at the pre-Socratics, I forget, did was there any is there any evidence of philosophical thought from the other older cultures like the Toltecs or the Egyptians?
Okay, I'm not an expert on any of that stuff. The Sumerians, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians all had cultures. It's not recognized when you study Western philosophy, and I don't think this is a result necessarily of chauvinism about Western civilization, because people are like, for instance, when I was at grad school, people were studying the Hittites and the Sumerians and so forth. But the kind of thought that we have so far covered in this class didn't seem to exist in, say, Babylon and in Egypt. They were very good observers of some things, like astronomy and some kinds of science, but they wouldn't this turning point where you just don't pay attention to mythology. It seems very unusual and absent. This radical, we don't know how radical it was because we have so little information about Thales and the pre-Socratics, just little fragments that were quoted 100 years later. That's the kind of stuff we have. So it's hard to say how radical it was when they were doing it, but it doesn't have a parallel in the other contemporary civilizations, where they just completely leave out mythology altogether and just talk about what they can observe and what they can rationally understand. And that is what we see with the pre-Socratics. And some of you have any of you read the Kirk and Raven book?
Yeah, I read
No,
parts of it.
did you? Was this addressed there? I haven't read it in quite a while. Was this
Mm,
that question addressed by Kirk and Raven?
no, I don't. Not really.
Right.
The I know that the Carvaka um, tradition or the school of thought in India was happening more or less at the same time, around 600 BC, um, and that was a materialist and not and indifferent to religion. They just it wasn't an issue for them. So it was very similar in a lot of ways.
I feel like sometime there's going to be this discovery of some unknown thing where there was this guy that traveled from India to Greece, but there are parallels between the Indians and the Greeks, but we have, like I've said many times, we have no evidence for that uh, actually occurring, for any communication between those two cultures. But it seems to have been in the air. I mean, that whole time in the last, say, millennium before Jesus and then following, it seems to be a time of spiritual explosion. You want to say it's almost a zeitgeist or something, but who knows? Like there was a virus that spread from land to land. Who knows? Okay, so I want. No, that's all I wanted to ask. I want to pick up where we left off on the Meno and the God. Look at that! I have my hand up apparently. I don't even know. Oh, yeah, hand. Where raised hand? Put it down. That's weird. Yeah, trying to get my own attention. Uh, anyway, I want to pick up where we left off on the Meno and the Meno. Let's raise this question: why, in the middle of a dialogue about whether virtue can be taught, do we have a geometric demonstration with the slave boy? What do those things have to do with one another? Nobody, nobody has any ideas. Yeah, go ahead, Otis. You're
Yeah,
muted.
no,
There you
I'm
go.
unmuted now. Yeah, virtue is not defined as we define it today. Virtue is defined as the ability to do something, whether that be, you know, a woman tending to her knitting or a man going out and killing animals. And so the question was, you know, dealing with geometric shapes could have been considered a virtue. That's my
I
answer.
think it's a little different. I think that the real question is how did the boy know the answer to the geometric problem? Ties back to how do we know what virtue is? It was an example trying to elucidate, an example of something that's more obvious, trying to elucidate the more subtle answer of how do we know what virtue is.
Right. I think the question Plato is raising is how do we, there's a bunch of stuff we seem to know, and he's going to have a wider range than just geometry. There's a bunch of stuff we seem to know as human beings that we can't really explain through experience. That's what Plato thinks. And like I said last time, the empiricists, the British empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume specifically deny this, as did Aristotle. But Plato thinks that there are things that these are observations that I think are very subtle observations that Plato made, and I'm going to list some others, about human awareness of things that they have no business being aware of. And we mentioned last time that one of the modern kind of applications of this idea is with Chomsky and his universal grammar, which he does not explain. In fact, he specifically says that a child could not have enough information, enough data. There's a poverty of information to explain how a child could sense the structure of grammar in the short period of time that he does or she does. So you're 2 years old, you haven't had billions of lines of text to examine and then to gather what the pattern is and how the rules work. You just don't have enough input to do that. Says that's what Chomsky says. And so he believes you have an inborn universal grammar, and that's what allows you to translate and be able to understand other languages that have the same kind of underlying structure. Yeah, Meredith.
Well, it's been studied that children who don't have adults who care about them speaking to them don't acquire language hardly at all. Children learn by listening to what their adults say to them. And in a family where there are adults and older siblings who talk to the new member of the family a lot, that new member of the family will become a talking wizard at 4 or 5. But in a place like an orphanage where people don't pay that much attention to the kids and don't talk to them particularly, it's not learned. So it's not innate.
Well,
I mean, the ability to learn
it is learned eventually, Meredith. They don't go through life without being mute and not being able to utter a sentence. They just don't have as much practice so it's not true that they don't learn language. Like birds, for example, there's a window of learning for birds. If you're a bird and you're a songbird, there's a period of time when you can learn the song of your species. And if you don't learn it, you can never learn it. That's the way it works. You can't go back in a couple of years and learn that song. It won't happen. You'll never talk. That's not true of human beings. That person that you say, they may be a little bit slow in picking up the language, but they'll still be able to have a job and work and be a regular member of society. So it's not like they can't learn it at all. This is Chomsky now I'm talking about, and this is heavily debated in linguistics. It's not like it's a given, but this is his theory, which I think is correct. Laurel, are you trying to say something?
Yeah, actually, it is not true, Tony, that if children are not exposed at all to language, there have been experiments, unfortunate things, where people did not talk to children at all. I mean, they heard no words, And if you
kind of
can't,
experiment would
and they
that
do not
be?
really, there have, they were, well, they were sort of, what, there was the question of what language would people speak if they were not exposed to any languages. And this was tried by some people in, I want to say 1700s or something. And it has also happened with children who, for whatever reasons, through severe deprivation, they don't actually acquire the language at the facility that we would have, or with grammar, if it's past like 13, 14 years. But the other piece of evidence that Plato might have found interesting, had he had brain anatomy, is people who have strokes or brain damage to certain specific parts of the brain. Certain kinds of dementia, for example, lose the ability to construct sentences, and you get word salad, but it's not, so they know words, but they can't put together sentences. So it is, I think there's some evidence that it is both hardwired, as it were, but also requires activation by exposure.
Now, are you saying, we can't talk about this forever, but are you
Oh, I
saying
don't want
that
to go off on this topic.
well, no, it's not off the topic, but I'm saying that Plato is somebody I could just talk about. I could literally talk about for another year. And it's hard for me to corral all the ideas that we're going to have to go over. And so we just can't spend all our time on any one aspect of him. But anyway, are you saying that the people who are deprived of language input don't, you what did you say about 13 or 14 years old? They still can't speak at all? Is that what you said?
They do not acquire what we would consider facility with language. They acquire words, but the full activation of language, the sort of wild children, the raised by wolf children or whatever, and there are cases of this, that it doesn't, the language capacity is not fully activated if people are not exposed at least to some language. And it doesn't have to be verb. I mean, signing works just as well if children learn signing early.
All right, well, just to reiterate, this is not Plato's theory. The language whole business, that's all Chomsky. I'm just saying he's a modern example of somebody who posits the same kind of internal mechanism that allows you to understand the structure of language. Chomsky says it's not Plato. Plato doesn't talk about being, he's talking about the facility to do geometry, but I'm going to expand that in a minute. He's not talking about language. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that
Plato asked the question.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have all the pieces to give answers, because
well, he doesn't have the anatomy that you have, and he's not going to know about brain damage and that kind of thing. So all that's been enhanced to a degree by modern science, but it certainly hasn't been resolved or anything. Like I say, this is a very heavy dispute within the world of linguistics. This is not, it's not like everybody agrees with Chomsky in linguistics. Anyway, I want to say, yeah.
Going to this issue of the Meno, I was very puzzled by this mathematical exercise. And it seems to be, and you can correct me on this, that what he's trying to do is introduce this concept that all knowledge comes as a remembrance and not as teaching. I mean, I think his argument, I think, found pretty specious in his use of this student as he clumsily gets him to the answer with nominally questions, as if he's not actually giving him the information to answer with. But that said, is that what he's up to in that thing, is trying to introduce this concept that all information comes from memory, and is that believable?
Okay, so yes, that is, as I said before, I'm going to introduce the two most fundamental Platonic doctrines are the theory of recollection, which is being demonstrated in this dialogue, and the theory of forms, both of which on the face of them are absurd. And a normal reaction is to think that's crazy. And my job here is to show you why it has seduced 2,000 years of philosophers to think it's not crazy and it's a central issue. That's my job. And I don't like it. It's an ugly job. I can't believe it's a heavy burden that I bear. I couldn't believe it when the state of California licensed me to do this. And I said, wait a minute, you sure you can't find somebody that knows what they're talking about? So anyway, yes, you're right, Gerald. The idea here is that we have knowledge that we could not have learned in this life. And as to Socrates leading the witness, leading the boy to the correct answer, my response to that is think about the fact that at one point in human history, nobody knew the answer to that. So nobody could have, whoever came up with it first couldn't have been taught by anyone because nobody knew it. And you have to believe that unless you believe that, say, a billion years ago, there was somehow microorganisms that knew the answer, and then we've inherited from that. If you don't believe that, you have to believe that at some time in the brain's development, we became capable of doing that kind of calculation or analysis, right? So Plato, he didn't know about evolution either, by the way. He's just observing the fact that that we can do these mathematical things. And the other piece of evidence, Gerald, is that everybody recognizes that it's correct. So even if he leads the slave boy, when the answer is finally arrived at, and I show my class, or no, somebody from my class guesses or finds the right answer, everybody immediately understands, oh, that's the right answer. Whereas that's not the same with any kind of knowledge that you would typically learn, like, you know, somebody's name, or I mentioned just the capital of a state or something. You'd have to specifically have learned that. And Plato's pointing out that there seem to be kinds of knowledge that you didn't learn in that way, you didn't memorize. And what I want to do now is expand it. The answer to the question I raised at the very beginning was, the question was, why is this in a dialogue about virtue? And I think you hit on it, which is that virtue is one of those things that Plato believes is recollected. And Plato's going to be one of the classic dualists. And do you remember we talked about Heraclitus was a guy who believed that everything changed, and then Parmenides believed that nothing changed. Plato is going to synthesize these two observations by saying that there is a world of perceptions, things that we perceive, and we learn from perception. We do. However, there are things that we perceive with our mind that are not perceived with our eyes and our senses. We understand them with our mind, and those things he thinks are recollected. So he has this thing in the Republic called the myth of the sun, or the analogy of the sun. And he says, the eye is to the sun as the mind is to the forms. The eye of the human being is kind of tuned to the output of the sun. In other words, if you take the spectrum of radio waves from the sun, radiomagnetic or radiation from the sun, the human eye is more or less aligned in its sensitivity with the rays put out by the sun, which raises the question, if our sun was putting out a different kind of radiation, would our eyes be different? But our eyes are also the result of evolution. And so there are other critters that we know have different kinds of sensitivities. Like a bee can see infrared light and ultraviolet light, and a pit viper can see infrared light. So we know that there's other animals that are perceiving a different universe than we are with their senses. And you might want to ask yourself, which one is perceiving the real universe? do our senses show us a picture of the real universe? How are you going to answer that question? Anyway, Plato didn't know about that. He didn't know about infrared and ultraviolet radiation. However, he did know that we can see things with our eyes that we can't see with our mind, and vice versa. We don't recollect, like I can't recollect what all you guys' faces look like. I have to see what your faces look like. So certainly there's a huge amount of information out there in the world that I couldn't possibly recollect. However, he wants to say there's also information in my mind that I couldn't possibly see with my eyes. And I'll use another example. When Einstein felt the same way, by the way. Remember, Einstein says the only way he can explain the fact that he can figure out structures of the universe just using his mind is that the only way you can figure it out is to assume that there's some kind of harmony or resonance between the laws of the universe and the human mind. That's a very mystical thing for Einstein to say, who's a mathematician and a scientist. Nevertheless, that's what he said. And I'll give the example of, you guys probably know the story of when the theory of relativity was confirmed by observation, because he came up with a theory of relativity theoretically, without you could not possibly have any perception that would lead you to believe in the theory of relativity, because you don't see time slowing down, and you don't see stars bending the light that goes around them. But this is exactly what was observed in the First World War. A guy named Eddington led a bunch of people out, and the idea was they were going to observe an eclipse of the sun. And the reason to do this was, do you guys know this story? It's just a great story. Plus, these guys were, I think some of them were arrested as spies because the First World War was going on, and they had this telescope and all this gear and stuff. But anyway, the object was this. By this time, this is First World War, so people had good star charts. They knew where the stars were. But the theory Einstein had proposed would predict that if you looked at a star behind the sun, it would not be in the same place that normally is, because the light would bend as it goes around the sun. The gravity of the sun, the mass of the sun would warp space-time so that the star would appear to be out of place. Well, the only time you can do that is during an eclipse, because normally you can't see the stars behind the sun because it's daylight. So these guys traveled to some remote place with a telescope, and it turned out the star was off by, I think, if I remember correctly, 1.75 arc seconds. It was out of place, which is exactly what Einstein had predicted. And so that's just astonishing that this guy figured this out from not using any data. He was using mathematics, the mathematics of his theory, to predict a perception that we were going to have of a star behind the sun, bending the sun's light, having bent it. So that was confirmed, and that was really astonishing. So anyway, of course, again, Plato didn't know this, but Plato's saying that this kind of geometric intuition that the boy has is not something you could actually learn from observation. You could learn it by trial and error, but you wouldn't learn the proof of it, and you wouldn't learn the logic behind it by observation. That's what he thinks. Now, Plato's going to expand this, because the forms don't just include geometry. The forms are you could think of them as the it would be like the laws of physics, except they also apply to aesthetics and morality. So Plato thinks that in the perfect world of the forms, we have perfect examples of beauty and also of justice, for example. Now, I have argued, I like to argue, this is a good argument to have in class. How do you think we know things are beautiful, and why do you think we know they're beautiful? Now, a modern deconstructionist or Marxist interpretation would be, we believe things are beautiful because we see Madison Avenue has promoted a certain kind of beauty, and that's what we respond to. So somebody, if we see a bunch of women that are skinny on a picture on the cover of a magazine, then we think that's beautiful. And then the example that people like to bring up is, well, hey, look at Rubens. Rubens painted women who were heavy. So doesn't that show you that it's just whatever we're exposed to that we think is beautiful? Meredith, where'd she go? There you are. Yeah.
I thought that symmetry was the basis for the idea of beauty.
You know, this is a great conversation. I think probably most people are symmetrically, most people that are beautiful are symmetrical, but I'll bet there's a lot of people who are symmetrical that aren't beautiful too. I don't think you can reduce it to that. I don't think you can reduce it to a rule. And I very seriously doubt whether you can reduce it to seeing a bunch of magazine covers. I could see be exposed my whole life to nothing but pictures of Betty White, bless her heart. But I don't think I'd think she was cuter than Ana de Armas, nevertheless. I just don't think I'd be convinced of that. And you know instantly when something is beautiful, and children know this. You don't have to, you're not taught what's beautiful, because if you were, you'd have to, if you saw a beautiful face, you'd have to go, let me think about that. Is that, it's like the capital of Arkansas. Do I have to go through my memory bank and see if what I'm looking at? No, it's like this instant, oh, that's beautiful. And it also applies now, I'm using faces as an example, but have you ever tried to get your dog to appreciate a sunset? It's like we have this aesthetic sense and we go, wow, that is, you're overcome by a sense of beauty. Why is that? Well, Plato thinks it comes from your internal sense of beauty, which comes from recollection, from the forms. Now, look at the theory of recollection is I'm going to use Churchill here because it's a terrible theory until you compare it to every other explanation of the same thing. There is no good explanation about why we have mathematical knowledge. And if you don't believe me, go, like I said before, go to Wikipedia and look up the philosophy of mathematics and read that stuff. And you'll find out that now these guys have spent their careers thinking about where mathematics comes from. And maybe Laurel knows a lot more about this than I do, but the point is that there are a lot of different theories and it isn't agreed upon. Like, I think we can agree upon the capital of Arkansas. I don't think we can agree on the origin of mathematics. So Plato's going to use what he calls recollection. And he also thinks this is true of virtue. So that's why it's in the middle of this dialogue. The middle of this dialogue, we have this demonstration of geometry because Plato thinks that's where all of the real eternal truths come from. And now I go back to the difference between the world of forms and the world of perception. Plato's not dumb enough to think that there aren't things you learn from perceiving things and experiencing things. Of course you do. But there are things that are not easily explained by that. And one is our sense of beauty, another is our sense of justice, and another is our sense of mathematics. Now, it's a good question. I was just talking about beauty, but where do you learn virtue? And that's kind of the subject of this dialogue. Well, if you think about where you learned it, you might say, well, I learned it from my parents when I was growing up. Well, then you have to ask yourself, do you always do exactly what your parents would have done? Do you buy everything that they taught you? Do you abide by their rules unerringly? And if you don't, then you must have another sense that told you, well, that rule that they told me, I don't abide by. For example, my parents were, I would call them benign racists. They were raised in an era where Black people were different and often treated very differently from white people. My parents were actually good and generous and went out of their way my father went out of his way to employ Black people. And I never heard a racist word spoken in my house, except that my mother thought Black people are different from us. And so I would call that benign racism. In other words, she didn't say different and terrible. She just said they're different. And I got into a heated argument about this with her. So at that early age, I thought that was wrong to say that. Now, how did I know that? Why did I know that? Because I hadn't been taught it elsewhere. Well, you might think, okay, well, I have other input. I have TV, I have peers. Maybe I learned it from then. But then you have to ask, how did you choose between the different views you were exposed to? How did you choose the one that was just? Yeah, Meredith.
Well, maybe you learned subconsciously that different meant inferior.
Well, whether I did or not, I would have had to have some kind of sense that that was not right, that I was arguing with my parents because I didn't think it was right. But where did I get that?
Fortunately, you did.
Well, but the question is, though, where did I get that? Where did I come upon the realization that this kind of view isn't correct?
How old were you?
Huh?
How old were you when this happened?
Probably about 8. You know, I had I met billions of Black people and compared them to billions of white people. In other words, was it a data-rich environment and I could make my own assessment? I don't think so. So somehow I had this sense that it wasn't a fair judgment without having any data. So how did I know that? I'm not trying to brag about myself. I'm trying to ask the intellectual question, where did I get that sense?
Well, I have an 8-year-old grandson who knows that.
Okay,
and his parents are not racist, but I don't think they would ever have discussed ways in which people who are of different races are different. They have not made that a topic of conversation at home. So, but he knows. And he's
right.
8.
So why does he know? That's the question that Plato wants to
Well,
raise.
Tony, maybe you turn the question around and say, where did your parents get, or your mother get, this feeling that they were different than her? And maybe that, because her world was so much more separate, that may be how she was able to get away from a sense of fairness in that.
I wouldn't be prepared to guess where she got it, but I just think it was the culture, you know, that in my parents' generation, people used the N-word without scruple.
Oh, that's not true. That is
not
not
in my family, but it certainly happened.
my family. It was, and it's not that they weren't racist. It was that they didn't want to be low class. Only low class people use that language and behave.
Yeah,
that
but
way.
it certainly didn't happen in my family either. It would never have happened. But I'm talking about in the United States, there were certainly people using that word frequently without getting busted for hate crime. It wasn't uncommon. Anyway, that's the era our parents grew up in, and you know, the armed forces weren't integrated, for Christ's sake, in World War II. So they grew up in a society like that, and maybe that's where they got them. But where did we get the idea that that's not okay? So anyway, okay, just get back to Plato here. We don't have to talk about sociology. Um, our sense of justice, Plato thinks, our sense of beauty, and our sense of the understanding of mathematics are all things that Plato thinks we did not learn from experience. We somehow have all these things inborn in us. Another modern guy who has a Platonic sort of theory is Jung, because he has the idea of the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is not an individual unconscious, it's a collective unconscious that we share with all human beings. That is not inconsistent with what Plato thought. He has a slightly different idea of the causation of it, and I can't remember my Jung well enough to know whether he attributes to physiological causes. I don't think so. But no, yeah, we got an expert here. This group is so unbelievable compared to my, I'm normally talking to high school kids basically. And we have Alice here, who's a trained psychotherapist. And so you studied Jung, Alice. Unmute. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, okay. Not particularly, but I mean, I've read him,
Right.
it's certainly come up. Yeah.
But, Jung thinks we have a shared consciousness with other human beings that informs our choices in, mating in particular. He has the animus and the anima. And all of us, according to Jung, have inside a male version if we're female, or a female version if we're male, and somehow those come back together. But by the way, that is Aristophanes' theory in the Symposium. In the Symposium, Aristophanes proposes that that's about love. We haven't gotten there yet, but he proposes that at one point we all had 4 arms and 4 legs, and then we were torn asunder. And ever since then, we're looking for our other half. That's Aristophanes' description of love. I saw somebody online saying it was Plato's theory, which is certainly not the case. Plato never appears, remember, in the dialogues. He never says anything. So this is Aristophanes, who's a character. And not only that, he's a comedian. I mean, Aristophanes is a comic poet. So, but that's one of the theories proposed in the Symposium. Okay. Anyway, so the doctrine of recollection, you're getting an idea of it. Now, the things that the mind recollects are the forms, not the things that we learn from our senses. And so Plato's, like I said, is a dualist. And he says the eye is to the sun as the mind is to the forms. In other words, our mind is attuned to the forms in the same way that our eye is attuned to the sun. I just mentioned that the spectrum perceived by the eye is consistent with the curve of the sun's output. And if we had another sun, we might have another sensitivity. Our eyes might have another sensitivity. But in any case, that's a little bit of a dodgy argument, I admit. But I'm just trying to draw an analogy between the sun and your eye, just like Plato does between the forms and your mind. So he thinks our mind is particularly attuned to the structures of the universe that are the forms. He believes that the world is ultimately rational and that there are these things, there are these laws that through which we understand the universe. Now, as mystical as that sounds, I think every physicist believes the same thing, that every physicist believes, at least as a matter of faith, that pursuing the study of physical, both theory and observation, will lead to an understanding, and the understanding implies that it can be understood. Plato believes this. And so I often say that every physicist is basically a Platonist, whether they know it or not, because they believe the universe can be figured out. That's different from what the Greeks thought before the philosophers. They thought, well, it's just whatever the gods are up to. You can't expect to understand what the gods are up to. But the philosophers and the physicists do believe they can figure out what the universe is, how the universe is governed, how the laws, and they've been pretty successful at doing that. It's not like it's some kind of weird fantasy. They figured out a lot of stuff about the universe, or else you wouldn't have a phone, you know? So, yeah, Doug.
Don't you just think that understanding the gods is just another part of that continuum of trying to understand and explain the world?
Except that the gods didn't have to respond to logic and rationality.
It was pretty logical, you know, probably seemed pretty logical to whoever was thinking about it at the time, you know, 3,500 BC, and God knows what the gods were up to, but explain things. They had a logical system of explanation, maybe.
Well, it's
like
also
a continuum of people want to know more, and they take a few shots at what they think they know, you know, and they
certainly
time.
But they thought the way to deal with that is just to make a sacrifice to the gods. You know, saying the gods did it is just an excuse for not having to figure it out yourself. It's like, I don't want to do my homework. Let's just say it's God that did this.
Well, if you throw someone in the volcano and the weather gets better, you know, maybe there's some, you know.
Hey,
I'm
not unsympathetic to this view. My life has been, it seems like my life has been, had an angel on its shoulder the whole, since the day I was born. It's hard to believe all this stuff happened physically and at random. So we're going to get to that when we talk about St. Thomas's teleological proof for the existence of God, and that's a very powerful proof that doesn't happen to work. Oh, is Peter, are you here? I don't see you. Anne is kind of logged in, but I don't see any.
Yeah, Peter had to make an errand of mercy and take a friend to a hospital.
Oh, no.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
I can't see you, but I can hear you.
I know you can't see me because I'm flat on my back in bed. I kind of overdid it with, and so you know, I'm taking it off today. Yeah, Peter will be sad to miss this, but we know this guy and he fell in a hole and broke his ankle, and he's impoverished. He's black. He's a Mississippian, and he had to be driven over 70 miles away for an emergency operation. So that's what Peter's doing.
Well, good for Peter. My God.
Yeah, I know.
He's a guy who has a recollection of virtue.
Yeah, he does actually. But you know, it's like, just an aside, this is the healthcare in Mississippi because he's black and doesn't have insurance. He had to spend yesterday getting looked at by a doctor who refused to operate, who said, "We're going to take your foot off unless you get it operated on and get antibiotics. And so you can go to Tupelo tomorrow and get the operation done." So Lord knows he had to show up at 7 o'clock this morning. It's an hour away. I don't know when he'll be back. You know, I hope it works, but yeah, it's a grim thing.
Jeez, in this day and age.
In this day and age, indeed, yeah. And Mississippi, of course, refused Medicaid. It's one of the states that refused Medicaid. So, you know, the whole thing sucks.
Nice move.
Yeah. Well,
I was going to respond to a comment he made or a question he had last time, but maybe we'll save that.
Yeah, sure.
For when he's back.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So the idea is that there's a world of forms and we can access it through recollection. Now, I'm going to, let me see if I can. So Plato is a dualist, and I'm going to list some things that are part of the way he distinguishes, Plato himself distinguishes things. We can start off with just distinguish distinction between Heraclitus and Parmenides. There's a changing world and then a world that doesn't change. So the world of forms doesn't change. The world of perception is always changing. That's Heraclitus and Parmenides. The world of forms is full of truths that are universal, not subjective or changing. Whereas the world of perception that we perceive is always changing and not universal. It's particular, to use Aristotle's term. The immortal exists in the world of forms and not in the world of perception. The world of forms, and we'll get to this when we talk about the idea of eudaimonia, being happy. Happiness will not be found in the world of perception, but in the world of forms. That's a little mysterious, but I'll try to explain it a little later. The forms are the most real thing. Now, this is a little hard to persuade anybody of, but Plato thought that the reality of something also, okay, let me see if I can do it this way. There's a line in McAtee will appreciate. There's a line in Freddie Hart's song, Easy Lovin'. There's a line that's, every time I look you over, so real to life it seems. That's Freddie Hart.
And he also says, seeing is believing.
Seeing is believing.
Yeah, that's the chorus.
And the thing is that doesn't it seem like Plato wants to say this in a variety of different contexts, but he wants to say that doesn't the beautiful seem more real to you than the less than beautiful? That's a real woman there. That's a real man there. And you have that sensation, whether you like it or not. It's hard to think of somebody as being super real. I mean, they stand out in 3D. It's just not just people, but a beautiful painting. So it seems realer. It has more reality. The geometry parallel is that a circle that we draw, that the square that Socrates drew in the sand, is pretty sloppy. And the one I drew, I did it intentionally that way. I could have done it on a computer. You know, the example I gave you of the Meno problem, I could have done that on a computer. It would have been perfect, or as perfect as you can make it with a computer anyway. But I didn't do that. I drew it like Socrates would have in the sand. But in your mind, you know it's a perfect square, and that you know that the solution is a perfect solution. It isn't sloppy in your mind. A circle is a perfect circle in your mind. It's not a sloppy circle. So as beauty is realer than it seems realer than non-beauty, the actual geometry of something in your mind is realer than any geometry we could draw or create in real life. So I'm just giving you a couple of examples of how Plato thinks about the world of forms being perfect, because it seems like kind of a fairy tale thing. Well, in the sky, there's this perfect tree, you know. That's not exactly what he has in mind. And it is ludicrous. It can be, you can describe it in a way that is ludicrous, that what he's saying is ludicrous. But, and another example of that would be, you know, I just mentioned Rubens, that there used to be a sense of the more ample woman being beautiful, and so styles change, and that's not the style anymore. I think the Platonic answer to that is that both of those participate in the ultimate sensation of beauty, which isn't one thing as though it were a statue. It's something else. And any beautiful thing on earth in some limited way participates. Not in the same way. Like you can fall in love with two different guys or two different girls, and they won't both be beautiful in the same way, but they both, for Plato, participate in beauty in one aspect. And that's what he wants to say. So anyway, the world of forms is realer than the world of perception. That's what Plato wants to argue, I think. Now, look, I got to back up here. Plato doesn't say any of this. This is all, okay, everybody, including me, everybody that's ever taught Plato has to say, well, this is what Plato thinks. You know, these are the Platonic doctrines, and they are, but he never says them. That's just an essential thing to remember about Plato, that he never will actually say this. And it's worse than that, like I mentioned, that he, not only that, but when he introduces one of his really important things, he doesn't even have Socrates say it. In fact, let me read from last time. Geez, I don't want, it's already almost an hour, so I don't want to go on forever here. Let me see if I can get I bet I can't. Oh yeah. No, that's not it. Okay, just last time I mentioned, however, that he, in the Meno, he has Socrates say that, well, Pindar said, the priests and poets of yore, including Pindar, said that knowledge is recollection. Socrates doesn't say it's recollection. He says some other guy says it's recollection. This is a device Plato will use again and again, not saying what he thinks, and not even having Socrates say what he thinks. He has Socrates quote somebody else. And this is underemphasized, I must say, in all the secondary literature, as if, well, yeah, you know, I think they assume everybody knows that, but it's an essential thing about Plato's writing that he never says what he thinks. And I think I'll cover one more thing, and then I'll let you guys off the hook. I want to talk about the divided line, since we're talking about Plato's dualism. I want to talk about the divided line, and then we'll call it a day.
Before you do that, Tony, can I just say something?
Yeah, sure.
Shakespeare is therefore the perfect descendant of Socrates, because Shakespeare has an answer to almost every perplexity of the human condition, but he never tells you what it is. He just he makes the questions such that if you're a good student, you can piece it together for yourself, and people will come up with different answers. But Shakespeare never tells you what the answer is.
Well, this is what I say. I had this discussion with Lowell. I had a philosophy teacher that my first philosophy teacher that said that he wanted to read the original sources because he'd rather have you misunderstand a genius than perfectly understand a mediocre mind. That was his quote. And he'd rather have you puzzled, I think is the word he used, by a genius than perfectly understand a mediocre mind. And Lowell said, that's kind of elitist. And I didn't know what to say, but later I thought, well, yeah, it is elitist. Plato is an elite philosopher. He's not Tony Johnson, he's Plato. And I believe in reading, just like Meredith, you brought up Shakespeare. I believe in reading Shakespeare and not somebody talking about what Shakespeare said or taught. And I also believe in reading Plato and not listening to Tony Johnson talk about Plato and say what he thought. All of the guys since Plato have talked about what he said, and none of them are as good as he is at saying it. But anyway, I'm going to do it anyway because we're forced to do it. There's, you can't just say, okay, read Plato. If you're going to try to explain it, and this does condense the experience a bit. It takes a long time to read Plato, and it's a lot worse than it seems. It seems easy, but it's not. Anyway, I mentioned he's a dualist, so I want to show you that this is something called a divided line that occurs in the Republic. And he talks about the divided line in the Republic. So I want to show you that. And let's see, here we go. Okay, this is the divided line. And so what we have here is essentially the line below the line is the world of perception, and above the line is the world of forms. And then on the right, you say states of mind. We can call that epistemology, what your mind perceives. And on the left, we have objects, which is what's in the real world. Now, this is going to be something that's going to be a subject of philosophy forever. But anyway, here's my way of describing how I view this from a childhood. And that is, when I was a kid, my dad used to listen to baseball games on the radio. And I had this very weird idea of what was going on because I'd never seen it. We didn't have a TV. I'm a kid, right? We didn't have a TV. I didn't know what a baseball field looked like. And I imagined something going on in 3D with players on different levels and stuff. And that would be down here at the bottom in images and imagining. I was just imagining from this description what the baseball game must be. And then my dad took me to a game and I went, oh my God. And it really was revelatory. I went, oh, this is nothing like what I thought. So that would be B on the second level here, the visible things and belief. And then after I went to quite a few games, I started to understand all the rules that they were playing by. But the rules of baseball, like the rules of any sport, depend on some fundamental principles. And the principle, the fundamental principle is fairness. And the idea of fairness is D here, I would say. Now, I picture Plato imagining this being a musical resonance. Like if you can take a guitar string and play a fundamental, just play an open E, and then you cut it in half and you have a harmonic. And I think Plato thought that the visible world resonated with the world of the forms. And so underneath all the things that are happening within your sight are the fundamental ideas. And those, in the case of baseball, the fundamental idea is fairness. And without the idea of fairness, none of the rest makes any sense. And I think that's how Plato thinks of the forms, that underneath it all, the foundation of everything is the forms and the understanding of the forms. Okay, so that's pretty mystical, but it gets worse. in terms of Plato, Plato's a mystic, but he's not a mystic like Meister Eckhart or the Buddha or somebody that goes into a trance. Saint Teresa goes into a trance, not my Teresa, but the Saint Teresa. She experiences these ecstasies and trances. That's not what the mysticism of Plato is like. It's more like an intellectual understanding of the mind's relationship to the universe, which is a mystical relationship. In other words, not one, because of its very nature, it can't be demonstrated empirically. Although, well, it can't be, but Kant is going to have a very good, Kant and Heidegger have very good insights into this. Okay, my God, I talked way too long this morning, but does anybody have comments or questions or things they'd like to add or detract from what I said?
So I got a question. We're
Yeah.
looking at these very detailed discussions that Plato is quoting Socrates. He was never there. And yet these are very complex situations he's discussing. What's the relationship here? What, is this just all made up?
Plato, Socrates died in 399, and Plato didn't write a dialogue for at least, we don't know. But best guess is about 15 years later. Plato was Socrates was his beloved mentor, and he saw him do this kind of thing many, many times. But he certainly didn't have a digital recorder and record all the conversations. So these are all recreations of conversations. Many times they're conversations that Socrates could never have had, and others are conversations that he may have had that we don't know. We don't have any record of. I don't know if that answers your question, but they are creations of Plato, but they're not fiction. We have every reason to believe that Plato was trying to be faithful to the practices and ideas of Socrates.
Right. So he's basically saying, okay, here's these situations, and he's doing a good faith reconstruction of how Socrates would talk, act, and analyze these.
Right. But it's not fiction in the sense that he didn't make this up out of whole cloth. We have every reason, because we have other sources about how Socrates behaved, and these are consistent with those. They're just more intelligent than those.
So partly what you're arguing is that Socrates is a vessel. He has no fundamental belief or philosophy. He has a methodology that Plato is engaging to explore what Plato believes. Am I missing that, or?
Well, it's not really answerable, Neil, in any kind of clear way. Plato himself says that everything he ever has written is just Socrates beautified and rejuvenated. That's his actual phrase that he uses. Now, I don't think anybody quite takes that at face value. Most people think that Plato has inserted some of his own theories. And my feeling is those theories are not inconsistent with what the real Socrates thought, but they also may be, when he says rejuvenated and beautified, I think he's amplified quite a bit. Most people, it's not just me, most people think that Plato has injected quite a bit of his own theorizing into the dialogues, but he never like, wait till you get to the symposium, but he never is clear that he never lays down the law. He never says this is the way it is. Never. He just does not do that, which is unlike it's the opposite of St. Thomas, for example. St. Thomas is going to give you a definitive answer, damn it. You can go away happy. Paul, yeah, you.
Just a quick comment. I get lost in all these words, but maybe there is an inherent belief that we have to be kind, and that dictates what our actions are. And maybe that's something that's inherent in human being. Obviously, there's lots of people that aren't kind. You know, we fought wars over that stuff. But in my personal life, I feel that's a guiding principle. Where I came about that, I don't know. I think it's the demonstration of my parents and others, but it seems like that's a better way to pass through the world than to cause aggravation. Your thoughts?
I couldn't agree more. Plato doesn't really address one of the things that's absent from and we'll get this when we get to the Christians. The three Pauline virtues are faith, hope, and charity, and those are not mentioned by the Greeks. That doesn't mean that I can't believe they weren't kind or generous or thoughtful, but in their ethics, they don't mention like generosity or empathy or those kinds of things. Aristotle does a little bit, and he usually gets chastised for it because he says, in order to be really good, you have to basically be rich. And that's a cartoon way of what he said, of saying what he said. But really, what he means is, if you're desperately trying to survive from day to day, you don't have time or the energy or the wherewithal to give anything to anybody else. That's what he's saying. He's not saying you have to be from the upper classes, but he's chastised for that. So anyway, it comes up in Aristotle. I don't know where Plato talks about that specifically, Paul, but I agree with you. It's part of human nature, and we'll get to it when we talk about Hobbes, because he doesn't think so. He doesn't think that.
Thank you.
Anybody else? About done with this. Okay, good. So I'll continue next time to, oh, you know what I should do? I'm going to continue next time to give you a more broad overview of what Platonism, what we think is Platonism, it's all reconstructed out of the dialogues. The dialogues are just like the ones you read. They never, straightforwardly say, okay, here's what we're up to. That's not what they do. So, let me see. I can do this, I think. Next time, I'm going to continue this, but we're eventually going to go on to the symposium. And there's no reason for you the symposium is really long, like the Republic. I have more stuff to say about the Republic. We haven't really gone into that for sure. I got more stuff to say about that. But I'm just trying to decide whether we'll get to it. What I was going to do is I'll do this. When I email you guys after this, when I give you the URL for the recording, I'll also include an attachment, which will be a section of the symposium, just the one I want to concentrate on, because it's really long and kind of difficult. And but you don't have to read it, but I'll send it along, because that's the next text we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the Republic in general. And, everybody should have read the Republic, I guess, if you want to know about Plato. But we don't talk about it. I'll just talk about it instead of read it, because it's quite lengthy. And this is one of the things I wanted to respond to Peter's comment about, but we'll wait till next time for that. So that's that. So anything else? If not, if there's nothing else, we'll just call it a day. All right, guys, lovely to see you. See you next Tuesday.
Thanks, Tony.
Yep.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks a lot.